The night is moonless. Above the narrow rooftops, clouds press low, muting even the faintest glimmer of starlight. In the cobbled streets below, shadows stretch and slide, not in idle stillness, but with intent, slipping from doorway to doorway as if guided by some unspoken purpose. The air smells faintly of damp stone and extinguished fires, heavy with a stillness that feels less like peace and more like anticipation. Somewhere in the dark, a boot scuffs against the ground. Somewhere else, a shutter closes quietly, too quietly, as if the night itself had ears. This is not the stage of a fairy tale, nor the grand set of a Hollywood epic. This is the medieval city as it truly was, cramped, cold, and brimming with whispers that are never kind. And in these narrow veins of stone and shadow, there walk figures you may think you know. Legends have painted them in strokes of mystery and glory. The cloaked savior, the invisible blade, the silent hand that bends the course of history. But the truth is far less forgiving. They were not cloaked heroes, but broken souls wielding borrowed blades. Not spirits of the night, but desperate men and women whose lives were carved into the dark by hunger, fear, and the promises of others. Before we go further into this tale, I want you to pause for a moment. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what hour has kept you awake for this story? Is it the quiet before dawn, when the mind wanders more freely? Or is it the heart of the night, when the ticking of the clock feels louder than your own breath? Let the room around you grow still for a moment. Picture it, the dim glow of a single candle in the corner, its flame bending in the draft that seeps under the door. The creak of a wooden chair beneath you, the cool weight of the air against your skin. Perhaps the faint hiss of a log settling deeper into the embers, the scent of charred wood curling through the air. Imagine these sounds and scents not as comforts, but as the only constants in a world that could turn against you at any heartbeat. For those who lived in the shadows of the medieval city, the night was both a shield and a snare. It hid them from the eyes of their enemies, but it also hid those enemies from them. Every step could be the last one taken freely. Every shadow might conceal a blade aimed their way. And yet, there was no turning back, because the path that had brought them here was not one chosen out of ambition, but one stumbled upon when all other roads had vanished. And so, our journey begins here, beneath the weight of a starless sky, in streets that hum with silent threats, where history's most feared and most misunderstood figures first drew breath in the dark. The story of the assassin does not begin with skill or glory. It begins with desperation. And once you step onto that path, there is no return. From here, we follow them into that descent, a life from which no escape was ever promised. If you imagine a medieval assassin as a lean, disciplined master of the blade, let me correct that image before it gets too comfortable in your mind. The truth is far more pitiful and far more human. A typical assassin was not forged in a monastery or trained by a secret brotherhood. More often, he was a man who once tilled a field, a woman who once sold bread in the market, a soldier who had been discarded when the war ended. They were people who had been pushed out of ordinary life, not because they sought the shadows, but because the light had closed its doors to them. Picture a farmer whose plot of land had been seized because some noble needed a new hunting ground, or a craftsman ruined by a lord's unpaid debt, or a young man who found himself on the wrong end of a false accusation, with his name turned to poison in the mouths of neighbors. When survival is stripped down to its barest form, when there is no hearth to return to, no hope of honest work and no name worth keeping, people make choices they never imagined they could. Or perhaps it's better to say that the choices are made for them. Becoming an assassin was not a dream. It was a drowning. Imagine falling into a wide black river with no shore in sight, carried along by currents of desperation. The water is cold, the night is long, and you can feel the weight of it pulling you under. The current chooses your direction, not you. That's how most came to this life, not with a romantic vow of vengeance, but with the dull acceptance that there was nowhere else to go. And yet, there was one lure bright enough to make even the most hopeless heart beat a little faster. Coin. Not in abundance, Not enough to buy land or status, but enough to fill an empty stomach for another week. The promise of payment was like a lantern in the dark, small, fragile, but enough to follow. A purse of silver whispered from the lips of someone in a dark corner could be the difference between freezing in the street and finding a bed in a warm inn. But those who followed that light rarely noticed the shadows it cast. The offer of coin often came from mouths that lied as easily as they breathed. A job might be a trap, a contract designed to end with the assassin's own death. Many learned quickly that when the work was done, the client's gratitude could vanish faster than the payment, sometimes replaced by a dagger to the ribs to tie up loose ends. Still, desperation has a way of drowning out caution. A man who has not eaten in days will take work from anyone who offers it, no matter the risk. A woman with no place to sleep will agree to a job without asking too many questions. And so, the pattern repeated itself. Poverty fed desperation, desperation fed danger, and danger more often than not fed the grave. This was the true entry point into the world of assassination, not a door marked with secret symbols, but a broken gate at the edge of survival. And once you stepped through, the way back was gone. Ahead lay only more darkness, more danger, and the thin hope that one job would be enough to keep you breathing until the next. From here, it is easy to see how the myth of the master assassin began to grow, tales told by those who survived just long enough to make themselves seem invincible. But myths have a way of hiding the truth, and the truth, as we are about to see, is clumsier, hungrier, and far less graceful than the stories would have you believe. If your mind is still clinging to the image of a hooded figure leaping silently from rooftop to rooftop, blades glinting in the moonlight, let's take a moment to laugh together. That's Hollywood talking, where assassins are acrobats, philosophers, and fashion icons all rolled into one. The real medieval assassin? Picture someone climbing a wall, not with the grace of a cat, but with the panicked scrambling of a man trying not to break his neck. The truth is less silent shadow and more, please don't hear me while I knock over this bucket. Training, as we like to imagine it, simply didn't exist for most of them. There were no monasteries hidden in misty mountains, no secret masters whispering ancient wisdom over sparring mats. The only curriculum was survival. You learned to kill by first learning not to be killed, and every lesson came with the risk that you might not live long enough to use it. Their skills weren't polished in a master's dojo. They were forged in the crucible of mistakes, burns, bruises, and the occasional missing finger. Poison, for instance, was not a refined art passed down through generations. It was a dangerous game of trial and error. An assassin might hear that a certain herb could kill a man in hours, only to find that it merely gave the target a severe stomach ache and a newfound determination to hunt the would-be killer down. One poor soul, it said, learned the hard way that twice the dose doesn't mean twice as fast. It just meant the victim noticed sooner, and the assassin ended up unemployed, permanently. The so-called stealth these assassins relied on was often a product of luck more than skill. A drunken guard on duty could be more helpful than any amount of planning. A sudden downpour might mask the sound of footsteps better than a lifetime of practice. If things went smoothly, it was less about flawless execution and more about the target being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the assassin getting extraordinarily lucky. And yet, there's a strange kind of respect owed here. To stumble into such a deadly profession without training, without support, and still survive long enough to take on multiple jobs, that took nerve. Or maybe desperation, which often looks the same from the outside. It's important to remember that for these assassins, there was no romantic creed, no noble cause. They didn't kill to uphold justice or protect kingdoms. They killed because someone offered them a coin purse heavy enough to make the risk seem almost worth it. The work was ugly, the pay was uncertain, and the odds of dying were always uncomfortably high. But when your belly is empty and winter is closing in, you don't ask for glamour, you ask how much. And so, behind every shadowy figure in the stories, there was a very human truth. They weren't legends because they were perfect. They were legends because they were still breathing. And in this line of work, that alone was worth telling stories about. From here, the question isn't whether they were skilled, it's why they chose to stay in such a grim trade at all. And that answer, as we'll see next, is buried deep in the glitter of promised coin. For the desperate, the offer of coin was a siren's call, sweet, irresistible, and ultimately deadly. Imagine it, the weight of a leather pouch heavy in the palm, the soft jingle of metal whispering of bread in your belly, wine in your cup, and a roof, however leaky, over your head. For someone who had been living on scraps and sleeping in doorways, that sound could feel like salvation itself. But like all sirens, the song lied. The promise was simple enough: gold today, glory tomorrow. The reality was usually far more cruel. More than one assassin discovered too late that the only thing heavier than a purse of gold was the knife slipped between their ribs once the job was done. Clients, after all, had every reason to tie up loose ends, especially when those loose ends could talk. Payment wasn't always in coin. Sometimes it was in silence, enforced by cold steel. The worst betrayal came not from a double cross in the shadows, but from the jobs themselves. That glittering contract to kill a duke? It might be nothing more than bait in a political snare, a lure meant to draw an assassin into the open, where soldiers waited in alleys and archers perched on rooftops. A rival lord might promise safe passage and generous pay, only for the assassin to find himself surrounded, disarmed, and shackled before he even saw his target. In this world, there was no court to plead your case, no justice to demand your fee. If your employer decided you were worth more dead than paid, that was the end of it. An assassin cheated of his coin had two choices: swallow the loss or attempt revenge, and both could end with his body swinging from the gallows. For men who lived outside the law offered nothing but a rope and a jeering crowd. Even when the coin was real and the betrayal stayed in the wings, there was always an unspoken dread. The more gold you took, the more dangerous the jobs became. A single pouch might feed you for a season, but a royal bounty could mark you for life. Word traveled quickly in the underworld, and a man known to take big contracts soon found himself hunted, not by his targets, but by other killers eager to claim the reward for his head. It was a cycle with no escape. You took work because you were poor. The work made you enemies. The enemies made you desperate, and desperation sent you running back into the arms of the same kind of employer who might, at any moment, decide you'd outlived your usefulness. So yes, the promise of coin was tempting, dangerously so. But every assassin who had survived long enough to speak of it would tell you the same thing. The purse was never as heavy as the price. And once you agreed to take it, the chain around your neck was already tightening. From here, the story turns from the dangers of betrayal to the simple, grinding reality of survival. The tools, or lack thereof, that an assassin carried into a world where one dull blade or frayed cloak could mean the difference between living and dying. If you're imagining an assassin's arsenal as a gleaming array of exotic weapons, stop now. There were no enchanted blades from a bard's tale, no silver-tipped daggers blessed by mysterious monks. More often than not, a killer's tools were a mismatched collection of whatever he could steal, salvage, or barter for. A single dagger, likely lifted from a drunk in a tavern, was a treasure. A length of rope, frayed at the ends, might serve for climbing one day and strangling the next. And as for a cloak, it wasn't the shadowy, billowing garment of legend. It was usually borrowed from some unfortunate soul and patched until the patches had patches. The reality was far from a knight's well-stocked armory. It was less a soldier's kit and more a beggar's scavenged hoard. Things found in the gutter, filched from an unattended stall, or traded for a night's work nobody wanted to talk about. Each piece carried a story, and rarely a noble one. A dagger might have a bent tip, a rope might snap under too much weight, and a cloak might smell strongly of the last owner's sweat. Yet these were the tools between life and death. Poison was no different. In theory, it was a killer's perfect companion, silent, invisible, final. In practice, it was about as reliable as the weather. One batch, brewed from a handful of crushed herbs, might drop a man in minutes. Another might only leave him clutching his stomach in agony, swearing vengeance between heaves. And on the worst days, a botched mixture could flavor the stew so well that the intended victim asked for a second bowl. Improvisation wasn't just a skill, it was survival. When a blade broke mid-struggle, the assassin might grab the nearest roof tile and bring it down with enough force to crack bone. If a rope was lost, a strip of torn bedding might have to serve in its place. Some learned to sharpen sticks into makeshift spears. Others relied on a handful of sand to blind an opponent just long enough to escape. There was no pride in these tactics, only necessity. Every tool had to be carried in silence, used in haste, and abandoned without hesitation. An assassin couldn't afford sentimentality. A cloak that had kept you warm for years might need to be left behind to avoid recognition. A dagger that had saved your life twice could just as easily be the thing that got you caught if it was traced back to a certain unsolved killing. This patchwork of weapons and trinkets spoke volumes about the life itself. Unpredictable, precarious, and always one misstep away from disaster. And yet, there was something undeniably impressive about the ingenuity it demanded. To kill with a weapon is one thing. To kill with whatever you can find at arm's reach is quite another. But however clever the tools, they were only half the challenge. The real test came when the target wasn't some drunk in a dark alley, but a high-profile figure, a noble in a guarded hall, a merchant surrounded by his own cutthroats. That, as we'll see, was a different game entirely. Some contracts were more than dangerous. They were practically a dare from the gods themselves. Nobles, bishops, even kings. These were not men and women who strolled alone through dark alleys. They lived wrapped in layers of protection, steel, stone, and unshakable suspicion. Every approach was guarded, every corridor watched. It wasn't just their lives at stake. It was the message their deaths would send, and the power that would shift if they fell. That made them all the more careful, and all the more impossible to reach. To even get close meant facing an obstacle course designed to break both body and will. Armored guards patrolled in overlapping shifts, their routes as precise as clockwork. Moats encircled fortress walls, icy and deep enough to kill a man before the cold did. Courtyards were well lit even at midnight, with braziers casting enough glow to erase any friendly shadow. And then there were the servants, those seemingly harmless figures carrying wine and bread, yet possessing ears sharper than swords. One whispered word from them could have an intruder dangling from a rope by dawn. Infiltrating a castle wasn't simply difficult, it was like threading a needle in a storm, the thread frayed and wet, the needle dancing in the wind. One slip of the hand, one misjudged moment, and everything unraveled. The targets themselves were often their own greatest defense. Paranoia was a constant companion for the powerful, and with good reason. They slept with one eye open, their chambers barricaded from the inside. Meals were tasted before a single bite passed their lips, and goblets were guarded as fiercely as treasure chests. Some even rotated sleeping quarters nightly, moving like chess pieces in a game only they understood. Even in public, they were fortresses of flesh and steel. A noble at a feast might appear relaxed, laughing over roast pheasant, yet his guard stood at his back, hands never far from hilts. A bishop delivering a sermon might seem vulnerable on the altar, but the eyes of his personal guard scanned the crowd like hawks circling over a field. A king on the march was never alone. His retinue formed a living wall, shields and spears angled toward any hint of movement. For an assassin, the challenge was enough to make the heart pound and the stomach twist. This wasn't a quick job in a quiet alley. This was a game of patience, cunning, and perfect timing, where even breathing too loudly could ruin months of preparation. The only hope was to become invisible, not by vanishing into shadows, but by blending into the scene so completely that no one thought twice about your presence. A servant with a tray, a monk with a bowed head, a stable hand mucking out stalls. Such guises could open doors that even steel keys could not. But disguise was an art in itself, one that demanded more than a stolen outfit. It required mannerisms, accents, and a convincing story for anyone curious enough to ask. And so, The assassin's path toward these impossible targets began not with steel, but with fabric, posture, and lies. The blade would have its moment, but only after the mask had done its work. For all the talk of daggers and poison, an assassin's most valuable weapon was often a scrap of cloth and the ability to walk as if they belonged. Disguises in the real medieval world were rarely the sleek flowing cloaks of stage plays or the perfectly tailored hoods of popular tales. More often, they were whatever could be stolen, borrowed, or stitched together in haste. A tattered robe from a laundry line, a mud-stained tunic traded from a beggar, or a monk's habit borrowed from an unattended bench outside a bathhouse. Blending in was less about looking perfect and more about not looking interesting. The trick wasn't to appear invisible. No one truly could. But to seem so ordinary that even the most suspicious eye slid right past. The problem was, when you're an assassin, the wolf beneath the wool never truly disappears. At best, it was like hiding a wolf among sheep with a bad haircut. From a distance, maybe convincing, but up close, dangerous. Every role carried its own hazards. A stable hand might be expected to know a horse's name or feed schedule. A monk might be asked to lead a prayer. A servant might be ordered to fetch wine from a cellar they'd never seen before. And then, there were the conversations. Innocent questions from servants or guards that could unravel weeks of preparation. One wrong word, one misplaced accent, and the carefully woven ruse could collapse in an instant. Some disguises added their own absurd difficulties. Take the case of the infamous sap beard, a fake beard glued to the chin with sticky tree resin because thread and proper glue were out of reach. It looked convincing enough under torchlight, but the itch was maddening. Imagine trying to slip quietly past a guard while fighting the urge to scratch your face until it bled. More than one job nearly ended in disaster, simply because the disguise fought harder than the target. There were moments, too, when the disguise became a prison. An assassin in a pilgrim's robes might be forced to sleep on cold church floors with the rest of the faithful, unable to break character for warmth or comfort. Disguised as a kitchen hand, they might spend days chopping onions until their eyes streamed, not from fear, but from the sting of the work. All the while, they had to stay ready, alert for the brief moment when their real purpose could be carried out. And beneath every role was the same gnawing truth. No matter how clever the disguise, it was fragile. One curious glance, one unexpected question, or one unlucky encounter with someone who actually knew the person you were pretending to be, and the whole act crumbled. In that instant, the assassin wasn't a servant, monk, or beggar. They were just a stranger with a blade. It was this constant dance, half performance, half deception, that kept an assassin alive. But it also meant living apart, never truly belonging to the faces they wore or the worlds they walked through. Which is where the next truth of their life begins, the cold isolation that followed them everywhere. In the world of the assassin, companionship was not a luxury, it was a liability. There were no guilds offering camaraderie, no sworn brothers sharing watch at the gates, no safe tables in familiar taverns. An assassin walked as a shadow, and a shadow could only trust itself. The closer someone stood beside you, the more dangerous they became. Friends asked questions, lovers noticed scars, neighbors remembered faces, and memory, in this line of work, was as deadly as any blade. Every potential connection was a risk that had to be weighed, calculated, and often discarded. A brief exchange in a market might be harmless, or it might be the thread that, if pulled, unraveled the entire disguise. Even kindness could be fatal. Accept a free meal too often, and the innkeeper might wonder why you never seem to stay in one place for long. Let a child grow fond of you, and they might talk about the nice stranger to a soldier looking for someone who fits your description. The life of an assassin was like a candle, burning alone in the dark. Its light reached no one. It gave warmth to no one. And any careless breeze, an overheard word, an unguarded gesture, could snuff it out forever. Even in the rare moments of comfort, there was always that quiet dread, that knowledge that every bond was a possible noose. This solitude bred habits that were part instinct, part ritual. Always sit with your back to the wall. Always keep a clear view of the door. Sleep lightly enough to wake at the faintest footstep. Never drink more than half your ale. Anything more dulled the edge of awareness. Even laughter was rationed. Too much joy, too much ease, and the mask began to slip. And betrayal, when it came, almost never came from an enemy. It came from those rare, dangerous moments when the assassin had let someone in. A tavern companion who noticed they never prayed like the rest of the town. A merchant who realized the coins they spent carried the stamp of a realm hundreds of miles away. A lover who touched a scar too tenderly and asked the wrong question. Trust was not just scarce, it was a blade you handed to someone else, point first, and prayed they would never turn it back toward you. The result was a kind of life that didn't feel like life at all. It was movement without connection, breathing without belonging. The assassin could walk through a crowded market and leave no mark on the world, not a friendly greeting, not a remembered smile, not even the trace of a name. And in this emptiness, one truth was sharper than any dagger. In their line of work, the only person who might save you was the same person who might destroy you. Yourself. Which brings us to the inevitable. What happens when that solitary figure makes a mistake? Because in the business of death, failure does not come with second chances. It comes with a reckoning. In the world of the assassin, failure was not a stumble. It was a death sentence wrapped in iron certainty. A missed strike, a botched escape, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, and the work was over. There were no appeals, no sympathetic ears. One mistake was enough to end a career, a life, and any trace that person ever walked the earth. The moment a job went wrong, the assassin's role shifted instantly. In an instant, the hunter became the hunted, a fox caught in a snare it never saw. The city, once an open maze to slip through, became a cage of alleys and locked doors. Every street corner might hold a watchman with a blade ready. Every lantern light a beacon to draw the net tighter. Word of failure traveled faster than breath. Guards were set on high alert, their eyes scanning every face. Crude sketches, sometimes barely resembling the real person, were tacked to market stalls and tavern walls. And yet, even if the likeness was poor, suspicion was enough to ruin you. All it took was one drunken citizen pointing and saying, "That's them," and your life would end in chains, or at the edge of a pike before you even reached the jail. And then there were the clients, the ones who had promised coin for the deed. Once the job failed, they became the loudest voices calling for your head. It was easier to erase you than to risk the truth leaking. Sometimes they'd even tip off the guards themselves, sealing your fate with a smile and a lie. There was no loyalty in this trade, only convenience. Failure was a tightening clock. Every hour that passed was another ring of the noose closing in. Safe houses became unsafe. Disguises were useless to those whose faces had been described to every soldier in the city. Even flight was perilous. The roads were watched, the ports guarded. And if by some miracle you escaped the first dragnet, you would still carry the weight of being known. A marked soul with nowhere to stop and no one to shelter you. The truth was brutal and simple. Assassins were never afforded the luxury of learning from mistakes. A carpenter could rebuild a crooked chair. A scribe could start a new page. But an assassin, one misjudged step, one misheard sound, and the only thing waiting was silence. The world did not remember failed killers. It erased them quietly and completely. And so every job was a wager against the inevitable, a gamble with your own life on the table. Sometimes you won, sometimes you didn't. But the moment you lost, the game ended, and the world simply moved on without you. Yet for those who did succeed, there was another side to the story. A moment of triumph so brief it could almost be mistaken for relief. A moment before the next shadow fell. A clean kill was the closest thing to triumph an assassin could claim. And even then, it was fleeting, brittle, and laced with dread. The moment came without fanfare. A blade slipped between ribs, a hand pressed over a mouth to catch the last breath before it could turn into a scream. No speeches, no dramatic pause. Just silence, and then movement again, because to linger was to die. Success was a spark in the dark, brief, hot, and gone before you could feel its warmth. There was no victory feast, no chest-swelling pride, only the pounding of blood in the ears as the assassin melted back into the shadows, praying the sound of their own footsteps wasn't too loud. The mark was down, but the real work, the part that kept you alive, had just begun. Escape was an art of chaos, down narrow alleys that stank of rot, over crumbling walls where loose stones threatened to betray you, under laundry lines heavy with dripping cloth. Every shout in the distance could be the alarm. Every door you passed might slam open with a soldier's spear behind it. And then there were the dogs, sharp-nosed, relentless, sniffing out the trail through the twisting veins of the city. The city itself seemed to conspire against you. Guards locked gates at either end of the quarter, choking off the exits. Market stalls became barricades. Windows above hissed whispers into the night. Even the moon, if it dared to show itself, felt like a spotlight. If you reached the rendezvous point, you still weren't safe. Clients were as dangerous as targets. They had their own fears, their own secrets to protect. A promised pouch of gold could just as easily hide a blade. Payment often came with conditions you hadn't agreed to, conditions that involved you not leaving the room alive. A dead assassin told no tales and demanded no coin. Sometimes the client vanished entirely, melting away into the same shadows you had crawled through to reach them. Sometimes they left a decoy to hand over a lesser sum, the real master nowhere to be found. And sometimes they were already gone, leaving you alone with the body you'd created and the tightening net of suspicion around it. So the victory of success was as hollow as an empty cup. You survived the night perhaps, but you did not walk away richer, only more hunted. Every kill added another name to the list of people who would gladly see you hanging from the city walls. Every job tightened the circle until even the shadows seemed too small to hide in. And still, they kept going. Because what else was there? The moment the blade struck true, there was a rush, a dangerous, intoxicating rush that drowned out the fear, if only for a heartbeat. The spark in the dark might be brief, but it was the only light they had. Yet for all the cold practicality of the assassin's world, there were whispers, superstitions, and strange beliefs that clung to their kind. Tales told in taverns about cursed blades, restless spirits, and the ghosts of victims who never let their killers sleep in peace. These, too, were part of the assassin's burden, waiting in the corners of every room, just out of sight. It wasn't just the blade that followed an assassin, it was the stories. In the back alleys and tavern corners of medieval towns, their names were carried on whispers, embroidered with enough fear and imagination to make them sound less like people and more like walking curses. To some, assassins were demons who walk unseen, creatures who could melt through walls, vanish in smoke, and steal a man's soul before he knew he was dying. Their reputation was a shadow that haunted them before they even arrived, a long, creeping silhouette cast over every market square and guard post they passed. People imagined their eyes glowed in the dark, or that their breath carried the scent of grave soil. In reality, the smell was usually just unwashed clothes and whatever they'd eaten 3 nights ago. Still, the myths had teeth. A lone traveler with a strange accent could spark a murmur that spread faster than plague. A sprig of unfamiliar herb in their pouch might be witch's poison, even if it was just for seasoning stew. The crowd's fear would swell like a tide, and all it took was one loud voice yelling "killer" for the tide to turn into a mob. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. The fear made them dangerous before they even drew a blade. It kept people at arm's length, made guards suspicious of strangers, and sometimes even persuaded a target to open their gates in the dead of night, hoping to bribe the assassin away from their door. But that same fear was a double-edged sword. It marked them, made them unforgettable. Even if they slipped away without a trace of evidence, the legend of someone having been there was enough to keep the hunt alive. Worse still, fear was contagious. One villager's suspicion became 10, and 10 became a watch with torches. A shadow in the wrong doorway could bring half a district to the streets. For someone whose work depended on being invisible, a reputation this loud was a curse in itself. Some assassins tried to play into the myths, wearing darker clothes, speaking in riddles, carrying strange trinkets, hoping the theatrics would keep people too scared to get close. Others avoided it entirely, dressing like farmers or beggars, speaking in the most ordinary tone they could manage. But no matter the disguise, the shadow of their name followed them, and sooner or later someone would see it. And so every step through the marketplace, every sip of ale at a roadside inn, carried an undercurrent of risk. The crowd didn't care whether the tales were true. They only cared that they might be. And that, more than any sword or gallows, could end an assassin's life in a heartbeat. Of course, there were other hazards in the trade too. Ones far quieter, but no less deadly. And perhaps the most treacherous of them all was the assassin's oldest companion, poison. On parchment and in whispers, poison always seemed like the perfect assassin's tool. Silent, discreet, almost elegant. No clanging swords, no messy blood, just a goblet of wine quietly doing the work while the killer slipped away into the night. To the untrained, it was the mark of a true professional. In reality, poisoning was like casting a spell with a broken wand. The theory sounded flawless, but the outcome had a nasty habit of ignoring your intentions. One dose might work in minutes, another might take days, long enough for the victim to suspect, confess, or simply recover. Worse still, sometimes the wrong herb or the wrong preparation did nothing more than sour a stomach and provoke a dangerous question. Who tried to kill me? The obstacles were endless. Nobles and high clergy often employed tasters, poor souls whose job was to risk an agonizing death so their master didn't have to. And tasters weren't always easy to outwit. A bitter aftertaste? Suspicious. A too sweet wine? Suspicious. A servant sweating under a cloak? Very suspicious. Even when the taster was fooled, there were dogs to consider. Loyal beasts trained to sniff out strange scents in food or clothing. And then there was the food itself. Stews and soups could mask flavors, yes, but they could also fight back. A thick broth might cling to a spoon, hiding the powder in one serving but not another, meaning the wrong person might take the fatal bite. Or worse, no one at all. An assassin might watch their perfect plan unravel as the intended target reached for the untouched bread instead. The margin for error was razor thin, and the consequences of failure were anything but. If the poison failed, you didn't just have an unfulfilled contract, you had a living, breathing, and now very suspicious target. One who might double their guards, seal their doors, and place a bounty on the nameless killer who dared try them. And unlike a botched knife attack, a failed poisoning didn't leave clues about who had been nearby. It left everyone suspect, which meant the assassin's own network could turn against them in fear. Even when a poison succeeded, it wasn't always clean. Some left visible signs, foaming at the mouth, blackened lips, convulsions. Such deaths were anything but discreet, and often prompted frantic investigations. The assassin's employer might suddenly find themselves being questioned, and in turn decide that the safest way to prove their innocence was to quietly remove the very person they'd hired. Despite all this, poison remained in the assassin's arsenal, not because it was perfect, but because sometimes it was the only option. It could reach where a blade could not, slip past locked doors, and kill without ever requiring the assassin to be in the same room. But those who relied on it too heavily rarely lived long enough to earn a true reputation. And that was the final irony. Whether the poison killed cleanly or failed spectacularly, the assassin themselves was never meant to be part of the story. Their craft thrived in silence, their name left off the tongues of witnesses. When the deed was done, whether by dagger, rope, or tainted wine, they were expected to vanish, leaving only questions behind. For in the end, an assassin's most valuable weapon was not their dagger, their disguise, or their poison. It was the anonymity of their legacy. For all the risk, blood, and sleepless nights, an assassin's name was never meant to be spoken. They were ghosts in their own story, drifting through the chapters of history without leaving so much as a smudge on the page. Kings might be immortalized in statues, generals in ballads, and merchants in ledgers. But the hands that nudged fate's wheel were erased as soon as the wheel turned. Their legacy was a ripple in a pond, gone before it's seen. There for a moment, shaping the surface, only to vanish into stillness. Even when their work changed the course of a kingdom, it was the patron, the general, or the uprising that was remembered. The killer, forgotten, unless remembered as a nameless shadow in a whispered rumor. Clients made sure of it. Secrecy was not a courtesy. It was survival, for them, not for the assassin. No trophies to keep, no marks to claim. Payment came in silence, and once the deed was done, the assassin was expected to vanish as though they'd never existed. Any loose thread, a name, a face, a boast, wasn't just dangerous. It was an invitation for the client to tidy up the matter with one more body. History, too, played its part in the erasure. Scrolls and chronicles didn't bother with the hand that struck the blow, only the moment it landed. The Duke died suddenly in his sleep, the record would say, or the bishop's carriage was attacked by unknown bandits. The truth was dissolved in the ink before it ever reached the page. It was a cruel contrast. Heroes are carved in stone. Assassins dissolve in shadow. Statues weather for centuries in public squares, while the most skilled killer might not even be given a grave marked with their name. The only epitaph they could hope for was a rumor that might linger in the streets, half-truths traded by drunks, or a child's scary story told by firelight. And yet, there was a certain acceptance in this fate. A professional did not kill for fame. They killed for coin, for necessity, or for the dark satisfaction of completing the work no one else could. To be unseen was, in its own way, a shield. Fame drew eyes, and eyes drew gallows. Anonymity was the closest thing to immortality they could claim, living on not as a person, but as the very idea that somewhere, in the dark, someone might be watching. But that comfort was thin, and trust even thinner, for the same hands that erased their names from history often reached for the knife when the ink was dry. Clients, after all, could not afford loose ends, and in their world, an assassin was always a loose end, and so the worst betrayal was not from enemies who saw them coming, but from the very patrons who had paid for their silence. If there was one truth every assassin learned early, it was this: clients do not hire allies, they rent tools. And when the tool has served its purpose, it is either discarded or destroyed. An assassin might imagine that a job well done earns a measure of loyalty, or at least gratitude, but in reality, trusting a client is handing a snake your only rope and hoping it doesn't coil back toward you. The motives for betrayal were as varied as the faces of those who paid for death. Some feared the assassin might speak, no matter how professional their silence. Others wanted to save the final payment and found that a body in the gutter was cheaper than a pouch of gold. A few acted out of sheer paranoia, unable to rest until every possible witness, even the one they had chosen themselves, was removed from the board. The clever ones disguised their treachery as generosity, inviting the assassin to a private meeting to discuss future opportunities, only for the door to close and the blade to fall. More theatrical patrons sent a second killer to clean up the first, the job framed as a matter of loose ends. It was an ugly truth. Sometimes the most dangerous assassin in the city was the one who knew your face. Payment itself carried risk. Every coin came with a shadow, and that shadow was the suspicion that someone, somewhere, was already watching. The heavy pouch might land on the table with a satisfying clink, but was it genuine reward, or bait to make the assassin linger in one place long enough for the trap to spring? Those who survived learned to treat every interaction with a client as a battlefield. Never meet in the same place twice, never turn your back, never drink the wine they offer no matter how fine. Some even refused to be paid directly, arranging for their gold to appear anonymously at a safe location days later. The paranoia wasn't a flaw, it was the only reason they were still breathing. The cruelest betrayals were not quick deaths, but slow, deliberate hunts. A client might leak just enough information to the authorities to set them sniffing in the assassin's direction, knowing the noose would tighten without their direct involvement. It was a clean way to remove a threat without dirtying their own hands, and when the gallows claimed its prize, the client could stand among the crowd, watching the execution with feigned ignorance. In the end, betrayal wasn't an if, it was a when. The assassin's trade was steeped in mistrust, and anyone who forgot that fact soon paid for the lapse. The best learned to expect treachery the way a sailor expects storms, as an inevitable part of the voyage, something to be prepared for at every turn. But even the most cautious couldn't escape one truth. There was no such thing as a quiet retirement for someone who had spent their life dealing in death. You think you'd be a sleek shadow, slipping silently through moonlight, your cloak billowing behind you, crossbow slung just right? Think again. This isn't a video game or a 2-hour film where you can save, reload, and try again. This is the Middle Ages, loud, muddy, and unforgiving. Surviving as an assassin here is dancing on a blade's edge in a storm, and you're not even wearing the right shoes. Let's start with your modern skills. You might know a few self-defense moves. Maybe you've got good hand-eye coordination from all that gaming. Or perhaps you run a decent 5K. Impressive, sure, in the 21st century. But in a world without hot showers, antibiotics, or central heating, you're already losing. By the time you've crept across one swampy moat, you'd have trench foot, a hacking cough, and possibly a leech problem. Your problems start before you even reach the target. The streets are not empty at night. They're full of drunks, thieves, beggars, and night watchmen who actually know every shadow in their neighborhood. You step wrong in a pile of manure, the smell announces you before you get within stabbing distance. And even if you slip past the guards, you'll still have to contend with the chickens. Oh yes, nothing ruins a silent approach like a rooster that thinks you're trespassing. Then, there's the human factor. You imagine yourself blending into the crowd, but the truth is, medieval towns are tight-knit. That maid you brushed past at the market? She remembers your face, your accent, and the fact that your merchant's hands don't have a single callus. The old man outside the tavern? He knows exactly which shoes belong to which stranger, and yours don't fit the pattern. Even if you miraculously reach your target, the real trouble begins afterward. There's no quick getaway car, no dark alley CCTV blind spot. You've got mud-slick cobblestones, barking dogs, and city gates that lock at sundown. And when they close, congratulations, you're trapped inside with an entire town hunting you. You might think you could rely on cunning, but that requires local knowledge you don't have. Dialects, customs, even the way people nod when they agree. Get it wrong, and someone will notice you don't belong. Worse yet, you'll have no allies to help. No one will risk their neck for a stranger, especially one with blood on their hands. And let's not forget the most likely outcome. You wouldn't even be caught by the target's guards. No, you'd probably trip over a cart, twist your ankle, or accidentally eat something spoiled and spend the next 2 days hiding in a latrine. By the time you recovered, the target would be long gone, and you'd still have a price on your head. The truth is brutal. You wouldn't survive long enough to be remembered. There'd be no whispered legends, no daring escapes written in the margins of history. You'd simply vanish. Not as a master of shadows, but as a nameless stranger who came, stumbled, and disappeared without a trace. But if you truly want to understand the deadly games of power and survival, it's time to step away from nameless shadows and look at someone who thrived in a world just as dangerous. Olympias, a woman whose ambition rewrote history. Before she was Olympias, she was Myrtis, a name spoken in the winds of Epirus, a land where mountains rise like jagged teeth and valleys whisper with the voices of old prophecies. This was no kingdom of polished marble and courtly manners, but a place of wild hills, sacred groves, and rituals older than the cities of Greece itself. Here, power was measured not only by armies, but by the omens in the flight of birds and the hiss of snakes in the grass. From the very beginning, Myrtis carried an air that marked her as more than a mere princess. She was a flame dancing in a storm, unextinguished, brilliant, unpredictable, and impossible to smother. While other girls were taught to weave fine cloth and pour wine with grace, she was learning the secrets of the priests, the rhythms of sacred drums, and the meanings behind the flicker of an oil lamp in the temple's shadows. Her youth was steeped in the rites of Dionysus, god of ecstasy and chaos. The festivals were not gentle affairs. They were frenzied nights where the air was thick with incense, chants, and the rustle of serpent scales. She did not shy away from the writhing snakes draped across her arms. Instead, she welcomed them, letting their cold bodies coil and knot like living bracelets. To her, they were not symbols of fear, but of wisdom, rebirth, and divine protection. The people of Epirus saw her as touched by the gods, a young woman who could read the threads of fate and tug them when needed. Myrtis understood the power of this perception. She cultivated it, not with arrogance, but with precision. She did not want to be a princess of silk and courtly smiles. She was shaping herself into something far more dangerous, a princess of omens and steel. Even as a girl, she had an instinct for influence. She listened more than she spoke, letting others reveal their weaknesses while she masked her own. She knew when to soften her gaze, when to let it sharpen like a blade. And she understood, perhaps better than anyone, that in a world where men claimed crowns through war, a woman's throne must be built from shadows, whispers, and unshakable resolve. Those who met her often left with the uneasy feeling that she knew more about them than they wished to reveal. It was not magic, though some swore otherwise, but a fierce, trained awareness. Myrtis noticed everything, the tremor in a voice, the twitch of a hand, the way someone's eyes lingered just a moment too long. And she remembered. Her destiny began to gather like a storm on the horizon. The winds of politics and prophecy were already turning toward her, carrying whispers from distant Macedonia of a king named Philip. But this was no ordinary royal match. This was an intersection of ambition and fate. And for Myrtis, soon to be Olympias, it would be the first step in a path lined with power, danger, and the hiss of serpents. That path would lead her straight into the arms and the court of Philip II of Macedon, where marriage would become both a crown and a battlefield. They met not in a gilded court, but on the sacred island of Samothrace, a place where the sea crashed against jagged shores and the air itself seemed thick with ancient mysteries. Pilgrims came here to seek the blessings of the great gods, to whisper vows in the darkened halls of initiation, to walk away changed. It was here that Olympias, still Myrtis to some, crossed paths with Philip II of Macedon. It was not a quiet meeting. It was a collision, ambition, and divine whispers striking like flint and steel. Philip, already a force in the Greek world, was drawn to her not merely for her beauty, but for the power that clung to her like a second skin. Olympias, in turn, saw in Philip not just a king, but a weapon, sharp, dangerous, and aimed at destiny. Their union was not a love story told in gentle verse. It was a forge where legends are hammered into shape, the air hot with sparks, and the ring of steel on steel. The island seemed to approve, or perhaps to warn. On the night of their betrothal, the sky erupted in lightning so fierce that the temple's shadows danced like living things. Philip later dreamed of sealing his wife's womb with a lion's emblem, and Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her belly, visions that priests interpreted as omens of a child destined to conquer. Some whispered that the gods themselves had a hand in their union, that a son born of such fire would not be bound by mortal limits. It was easy in those early days to believe the marriage was charmed. Together, they stood like twin pillars, he, the master of armies, she, the mistress of omens and sacred rites. Olympias did not shrink from Philip's ambition. She matched it, feeding it, sharpening it, bending it toward her own designs. In council, she could whisper a word that tilted the course of policy. In private, she could match his temper blow for blow. Yet even at its height, their marriage carried an undercurrent of unease. Power such as theirs could not be shared without friction. Philip, used to command, found in Olympias a partner who would not yield simply because she was a wife. Olympias, used to the respect accorded to a living emblem of divine favor, chafed at the political maneuvering that often placed her influence in the shadows. The omens that had once seemed like blessings began to feel like warnings. The same lightning that heralded their union could just as easily split it apart. Court whispers grew, of Philip's alliances with other women, of Olympias's unyielding will, of a tension building between them that no priest could soothe. Still, the bond between them endured, forged less by tenderness than by mutual recognition. They were not just rulers, but architects of destiny. And in that shared vision, they could tolerate the sparks that threatened to burn them both. For now, their eyes were fixed on the child that prophecy promised, a son who would carry both their ambitions into the world. But even as that child grew, so did the fractures in their marriage, hairline cracks that would spread beneath the weight of jealousy, politics, and betrayal. Philip's court was never meant to be a place of singular devotion. For him, marriage was not merely a bond between two people. It was a weapon in the arsenal of kingship. Each new bride was a treaty sealed in flesh. Each wedding feast, another stitch in the vast political net he cast across the Greek world. But for Olympias, those alliances became a web of silk that strangled instead of bound, tightening around her influence until it began to choke. She was not the kind of queen to fade into the background, but the palace seemed determined to make her just another piece on a chessboard where queens were treated as pawns. Every new wife brought with her a retinue of scheming relatives, each whispering in the corridors, each angling for favor, each with an eye on the throne, not for themselves, but for the sons they hoped to place there instead of Alexander. If Philip thought Olympias would accept this quietly, he had misjudged her entirely. She countered his political marriages not with tears or submission, but with defiance. She held her own court within the palace walls, a gathering steeped in incense and murmured prophecies. Oracles came and went in shadowed corridors, speaking of fate and divine wrath. There were nights when chanting could be heard long after the rest of the palace slept, rituals not meant for the faint of heart, where serpents slithered over her arms like living jewels, a reminder of the power she claimed from gods older than Macedon itself. Then came the birth of her son. The omens were so vivid that even the skeptics in Philip's court held their tongues. On the night Alexander came into the world, witnesses swore the air shimmered with heat, though no flame was near, as if the room was lit by flames that did not burn. Priests declared the child marked by Zeus himself, a ruler born to shatter empires. Olympias embraced the prophecy like armor. If the court sought to undermine her, they would have to contend with the divine shadow, now cast over her son. Yet even in that moment of triumph, the undercurrents of danger ran deep. Philip's other wives watched with narrowed eyes, their kin plotting how to dull the edge of Olympias's ascendancy. The chessboard shifted again, and this time, Olympias was no pawn. But neither was she the only queen in play. The palace began to hum with rivalry, each faction sharpening its claws, and soon, the private war between Olympias and her enemies would spill into the open halls of Macedon. In Macedon, the throne room was not the true seat of power. It was the corridors, the antechambers, the whispered conversations at banquets. It was a den of vipers, each coiled in the warmth of Philip's favor, waiting for the moment to strike. And in that nest, Olympias was the deadliest serpent of all. Her influence moved unseen, a shadow that shifted before the light itself, so that by the time her enemies sensed her approach, they were already ensnared. Servants, messengers, guards, each was a thread in the quiet web she spun. A passing glance at a council meeting, a shared cup at a feast, an oracle's pronouncement accidentally overheard. Olympias's touch was subtle, but it left marks that could change the course of alliances. But in the shifting tides of Philip's court, one rival loomed larger than the rest. Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian bride whose lineage was pure and whose beauty turned heads in the torchlight. To the untrained eye, she was a mere ornament in Philip's expanding collection of queens. To Olympias, she was a blade aimed at Alexander's future. For if Cleopatra bore Philip a son, that child, Macedonian by both bloodlines, would have a claim even stronger than Alexander's. Olympias understood that threats to her son were not always born in the battlefield. They could be swaddled in silk, sung to sleep by nursemaids, and raised under the approving gaze of the king himself. And so, her war with Cleopatra was fought not with armies, but with symbols, whispers, and the heavy weight of ritual. The rituals were never only acts of devotion. When Olympias poured wine for Dionysus, the court saw more than piety. They saw the queen in communion with a god of ecstasy and chaos, a power beyond mortal kings. When serpents slithered at her feet during festivals, it was not mere tradition. It was a declaration that she was a force entwined with the old gods, dangerous to touch. Even her mourning clothes, worn longer than custom demanded after her father's death, spoke a language the court understood: defiance, persistence, and a refusal to fade. She made allies not through warmth, but through necessity, binding generals, priests, and foreign envoys to her cause. Every feast became a contest of influence, every marriage negotiation a skirmish. Cleopatra's faction pressed for her elevation, whispering promises of a future where Olympias would be nothing more than a discarded relic of Philip's ambitions. Olympias countered with a slow, relentless tightening of the noose, poisoned reputations, manipulated omens, and the quiet exile of those whose loyalty wavered. By the time Philip began preparations for his grand campaign against Persia, the palace itself had become a war zone in miniature. The clink of goblets at royal banquets masked the tension of rival spies watching each other across the hall. Musicians played, but their notes trembled in the charged air. Olympia stood at the center of it all, a queen whose smile could mean salvation or ruin. And then, as if the gods themselves had chosen their moment, the simmering war of shadows ended not with a quiet coup, but with the sudden, shocking stroke of Philip's assassination, an act that would shatter the palace and set Alexander on the path to empire. It happened not on a battlefield, but in a place of celebration. The wedding hall shimmered with gold and wine, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meats and garlands of fresh flowers. Musicians played, laughter rolled like warm thunder. And then came the real thunderclap. Philip, king of Macedon, conqueror of Greece, was walking proudly between rows of allies and subjects when the blade struck. The sound was almost swallowed by the music, a gasp, a shuffle, the faint wet sound of steel leaving flesh. A moment later, the king lay crumpled on the polished floor, blood pooling against the marble like spilled wine. It was over in an instant. One heartbeat, he was invincible. The next, he was gone. The court was a tapestry unraveling with one cut, threads of alliances, loyalties, and ambitions snapping loose all at once. Pausanias, one of Philip's own bodyguards, was the name shouted in the chaos. They said he fled. They said he was cut down before he could escape. Officially, it was vengeance for a personal insult, the kind of story that courts tell themselves to hide uglier truths. But in the shadows of the Golden Hall, other whispers stirred. Was Alexander, the heir apparent, too conveniently placed to seize the throne? Or had the serpent's whisper guided the blade? Olympias's name was never spoken openly, but it drifted through the corridors like smoke, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to ignore. She had motive, the removal of a husband who had threatened her position, the protection of her son's claim against rivals. And she had the mind for such a strike, not a reckless assassination, but a precise theatrical blow at the perfect moment. She was nowhere near the king when it happened, and yet, her absence was almost as telling as her presence might have been. Some swore they saw her that morning, speaking quietly with men who vanished from Macedon soon after. Others claimed she had simply been preparing for the wedding rites, her hands clean of blood, but perhaps not of intent. No one could prove anything. Perhaps she was guilty. Perhaps she simply understood the game well enough to let someone else make the move. But whether she had given the order or merely stepped into the opportunity, the effect was the same. Philip was gone, and the air around Olympias seemed charged, as though the gods themselves had shifted their favor. In the days that followed, the palace was a maze of fear and speculation. No one knew which way to bow, whose orders to follow. But Olympias knew. She always knew. And whatever truth lay behind Philip's final breath, it was she who would decide what happened next. What followed was no quiet morning. Olympias moved with cold precision, cutting away rivals, purging threats, and securing Alexander's throne with a brutality that would leave Macedon gasping. The morning for Philip had barely cooled before Olympias made her move. Where others hesitated, waiting for the dust to settle, she became the dust storm itself, swift, suffocating, impossible to escape. The court had expected politics. What they got was a purge. Her first and most symbolic act was aimed at Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's last wife, and her newborn daughter. To Olympias, they were more than rivals. They were seeds of dissent that, if left to grow, could split Macedon's loyalty away from Alexander. Their removal would be a public lesson in power, one that left no room for misinterpretation. Accounts differ on how it happened. Some say Cleopatra was forced to watch her child die before she herself was executed. Others claim she took her own life after seeing the writing on the palace walls. Whatever the truth, it was brutal, and it was deliberate. Olympias wanted the court to understand. Compassion was weakness, and weakness had no place near the throne. She moved from chamber to chamber, city to city, dismantling opposition with a precision that felt less like politics and more like divine wrath. Threats were her lightning bolts, flattery her soft rain, each used exactly when needed. Ambitious generals found themselves suddenly promoted, only to discover their loyalty had been bound with invisible chains. Local nobles received gifts of land, but only in regions where they would remain under her gaze. She was a storm that drowns rivals in its wake, her presence flooding the political landscape until no one could breathe without her permission. Even the most seasoned courtiers found themselves bending lower, speaking softer, their eyes flicking to the shadows as if afraid she might materialize behind them. And yet, amid this whirlwind, there was Alexander, newly crowned, brilliant, young, and watching. He had inherited her cunning, but not her taste for cruelty. The purge unsettled him. The sight of blood on the same marble floors where his father had been honored just days before was not the vision he wanted for his reign. Still, he understood the necessity. Without her decisive and terrifying actions, his claim might have been torn apart before he could even lead his first campaign. So he said nothing. He allowed her to be his shield, even if it meant her becoming his shadow as well. Their partnership was uneasy, but effective. Olympias carved the path, and Alexander walked it, whether he approved of the paving stones or not. By the time the purge was complete, Macedon stood firmly under Alexander's banner, but it was not the same kingdom Philip had ruled. It was leaner, sharper, and infused with the will of a queen mother who would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect her son's place in history. With the court cowed and the rivals erased, Olympias did not retreat. Instead, she embraced a new role, not merely as Alexander's mother, but as his guardian in spirit and politics, watching over him even as he prepared to leave her for the world beyond Macedon. When Alexander marched east to chase the horizon, Olympias remained in Macedon, not as a grieving mother waving from the palace gates, but as a sentinel. Her son might wield the sword, but she guarded the thread of his fate. Each campaign was shadowed by her presence, though she was hundreds of miles away. Before his departure, she performed rites in the deep hours before dawn, weaving fate with relics, amulets blessed in the shrines of Dodona, libations poured over bronze effigies of the gods. She wrapped Alexander's ambition in layers of divine protection. The palace servants whispered of her chambers glowing with candlelight until sunrise, the air thick with incense and murmured invocations. To Olympias, these were not mere gestures. She believed Alexander's life was a sacred charge, ordained by the gods she served with fanatical devotion. If he faltered, the world's balance would shift. And so, she became a priestess guarding a flame against the wind, shielding that brilliance from every gust, whether it came from enemy armies or the subtler breezes of courtly intrigue. Her reach extended through ink as much as ritual. Letters flew between Macedon and the front lines, carried by trusted envoys who feared her more than any foreign king. These were not soft words of maternal comfort. They were sharp, measured, laced with political strategy. She praised his victories, but she also probed his choices, questioning his adoption of Persian dress and customs, warning of the dangers of alienating his Macedonian troops. Her pen could be as cutting as any blade, and Alexander knew better than to dismiss her counsel outright. Yet beneath her guidance pulsed a deeper, more unsettling truth. Olympias did not just want her son to succeed, she wanted him to fulfill a destiny she believed was divine. She had been telling him since boyhood that he was not merely Philip's heir, but the living embodiment of Zeus's will. Every victory confirmed her belief. Every setback was an affront to the gods themselves. It was a burden Alexander bore as much for her sake as for his own ambition. Her devotion was both a gift and a shackle. She inspired him, yes, but she also bound him to a path from which deviation felt like blasphemy. Even in the furthest reaches of Asia, he could feel her gaze, as if Olympias herself stood in the desert wind, watching to see whether her flame would burn brighter or flicker out. But her guardianship of Alexander's legacy did not end at the palace gates. In Macedon, her power brought her into direct conflict with the man Alexander had left in charge of the homeland, Antipater. And unlike the gods, Antipater was not easily swayed by omens and incense. When Alexander rode east, he left Antipater, a grizzled general with decades of service, to govern Macedon in his absence. On paper, it was a practical decision. In practice, it was the beginning of a cold war within the palace walls. Olympias was not the kind of queen mother to fade quietly into ceremonial duties, and Antipater was not the kind of man to tolerate shadows creeping into his authority. Their conflict began subtly, like a slow tightening of a bowstring. Olympias moved through the court not with open defiance but with precision, a chess move against a general who believed the board was his alone. She met with nobles Antipater considered loyal, offering them not orders, but stories. She spoke of Alexander's divine mission, of the sacred bloodline she embodied, of the dangers of too much power in the hands of a man whose loyalty, she hinted, might be more to himself than to the crown. Her weapon was not the sword, but the whisper. Her whispers were arrows fired from the shadows, never traced directly to her, but always striking their target. A remark at a banquet about misplaced tax revenues, a casual observation about Antipater's unusually long correspondence with certain Greek city-states, a raised eyebrow when someone mentioned his military musters. She planted seeds of doubt in fertile ground, letting others carry the suspicion to Alexander's ear. Letters became her battlefield. Olympias wrote to her son with an artful balance of reverence and warning. She praised Antipater's competence, just enough to make her criticisms seem fair. Then, with the deftness of a seasoned tactician, she questioned his intentions. Was the regent growing too comfortable in power? Did he view Alexander's campaigns as distractions rather than destiny? Could a man who bowed to no god but strategy truly be trusted with an empire? Alexander, ever conscious of his mother's insight and her ability to sense weakness in others, listened. The rift widened. Antipater began to receive curt, formal missives instead of warm instructions. His authority in certain matters was quietly curtailed. The tension between them was no longer a secret. Courtiers began to take sides, measuring their words depending on whether they spoke under Antipater's gaze or Olympias's. Macedon became a divided court, its ruler absent, its two guardians locked in a silent duel neither could afford to lose. Olympias's advantage was her identity, a queen mother who bowed to no one. She did not command armies, but she commanded lineage, the aura of divine purpose, and the loyalty of those who feared offending Alexander's blood. Antipater's advantage was subtler, but just as potent. The machinery of governance, the allegiance of seasoned officers, and the practical power of being the man actually in charge. It was a standoff defined by patience and precision, each waiting for the other to make a move that could be turned into grounds for removal. Olympias pushed at the edges of Antipater's authority, and Antipater quietly documented each slight, for the moment Alexander might finally choose between them. That choice would never come, for before the duel could reach its climax, word came from Babylon, a message that would tear through the heart of the empire. Alexander was dead, and the fragile balance they had maintained would collapse into chaos overnight. The news came like a blade drawn in silence, no warning, no time to steal the heart. In Babylon, far from the hills of Macedon, Alexander the Great lay dead. The man who had seemed untouchable, kissed by gods and crowned by destiny, was gone. A star had fallen, leaving darkness in its wake. And in that darkness, the whispers began. Macedon did not mourn as one. Some wept in genuine grief. Others hid smiles behind funeral veils, calculating their next move before the body had even cooled. Across the empire, satraps and generals clutched at territory like scavengers over a carcass. The empire was a mosaic shattered by greed, its beautiful unity splintered into jagged pieces, each cutting into the other. For Olympias, the loss was both personal and political. She had lost her son, the living embodiment of her divine ambitions. But grief was a luxury she could not afford. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, she understood the truth. The dream of a unified empire under Alexander's name was dead with him. Now, survival was all that remained. Her eyes turned to the one fragile thread left to weave her destiny, Alexander IV, her young grandson. The boy was a symbol, a living heir, and in him she saw the last chance to keep the blood of gods upon the throne. But symbols are dangerous in a world ruled by ambitious men. The Diadochi, the so-called successors, moved quickly. They spoke of loyalty, but their actions dripped with hunger. Each claimed to act for the good of the empire, yet each gathered troops, hoarded coin, and whispered in the ears of allies. The funeral games had barely ended before the real game began. Who would control the child king, and through him, the throne? Olympias knew the answer had to be her. If she lost Alexander IV to another's influence, he would be nothing more than a puppet until the day he became inconvenient and quietly disappeared. Her mind worked like a blade, slicing through sentiment to cold calculation. She had to act before the wolves circled too close. One name rose above the rest as both ally and necessity: Roxana, Alexander's widow and the boy's mother. Their relationship had been cautious at best, strained by differences in culture, faith, and court politics. But now, blood was a stronger bond than rivalry. Together, they could form a barrier between the boy and the hands that sought to control him. Olympias's decision was made. She would bind herself to Roxana's cause, if only to protect the child they both claimed as their future. Survival was no longer about divine dreams. It was about outmaneuvering generals, regents, and even supposed allies. And so, the Serpent Queen and the Widow forged an alliance, each watching the other even as they stood side by side. It was an uneasy union born of necessity, one that would be tested as civil war crept closer with every step. In the shadow of Alexander's death, two women stood where armies dared not tread, side by side, yet never fully trusting. Olympias, the Serpent Queen of Epirus, and Roxana, the Bactrian widow of the conqueror, found themselves bound by one thing stronger than rivalry: the survival of Alexander IV. Two queens guarding a fragile crown, aware that the smallest crack could shatter it forever. The boy was barely old enough to understand the weight on his shoulders. To the generals, he was a pawn. To the people, a symbol. To his mother and grandmother, a seed in a storm, needing shelter. Olympias knew seeds could grow into mighty trees, but only if they were not crushed underfoot before taking root. The storm was already gathering. Across the empire, the Diadochi tore at each other's territories, each claiming to be the rightful guardian of Alexander's legacy. But their loyalty extended only as far as it served their ambition. In the north, Antipater's influence still lingered, his allies looking for any chance to seize control. In the west, warlords tested their borders. And in Macedon itself, a new and dangerous figure rose, Cassander, son of Antipater. Cassander's smile was a mask, his politeness a blade kept sheathed until the moment it would strike. He spoke of order, of protecting Macedon, but Olympias knew better. Men like Cassander saw children on thrones not as rulers to protect, but as obstacles to remove. His ambition was patient, and patience in politics was often deadlier than open war. Olympias's resolve hardened. She had faced vipers before, some in the wild hills of Epirus, others in the marble halls of Macedon, but never had she guarded something this vulnerable, this irreplaceable. She told herself, again and again, no warlord will erase my son's legacy. Her son's blood, divine blood, as she believed, flowed in this boy's veins. To kill him would be to kill the last spark of Alexander's greatness, and that she would never allow. Roxana, though less seasoned in court warfare, understood the stakes. Her methods were quieter, her influence more subtle, but she shared Olympias's protective instinct. They formed a pact, not of love, but of necessity. One watched the throne from the outside, manipulating the web of politics. The other kept the boy close, shielding him from any accidental cups of wine or stray blades. Every decision became a calculation. Whom to trust with their messages, which servants could be near the boy, which generals to flatter, and which to quietly threaten. Olympias even revived her old rituals, not for worship alone, but as theater, projecting the aura of a woman protected by the gods. Fear could be as potent as armies. Yet even as she plotted, Olympias knew this alliance could not hold forever, not with the world pressing in and enemies multiplying. The boys' survival depended on more than secrecy and alliances. They needed ground they could control, walls to keep out those who smiled too much, and the ability to strike first if necessary. And so, Olympias's gaze turned homeward. To Macedon, where her name still carried the weight of a queen, and where she believed she could shield her grandson from the coming storm. But the road home would not be a return to safety. It would be a march straight into the heart of danger. She did not creep back into Macedon like an exile begging for pardon. She descended upon it with the force of prophecy fulfilled. With Polyperchon's army at her back, Olympias returned not as a widow or a grandmother, but a queen reclaiming her stage. Her banners snapped in the wind, her presence as fierce as it had been in the days when Philip and Alexander still walked the earth. To the people, her march felt like an omen. The clatter of shields and hooves on the road was a heartbeat growing louder with every mile. Her arrival was a thunderbolt splitting the sky, sudden and irresistible. Town after town opened its gates without a fight, citizens pouring into the streets to see the woman whose name had been whispered for decades in tones of awe and fear. The army she commanded was not merely Polyperchon's, it became hers. Veterans who had fought under Alexander now pledged themselves to her cause, drawn by loyalty to his bloodline or fear of her wrath. Younger soldiers too young to have known Alexander still found themselves caught in her gravity, convinced they marched behind a figure blessed by destiny. Cassander, ever calculating, had underestimated the depth of her influence. While he maneuvered in the shadows, Olympias moved in daylight, her victories public and resounding. The momentum was hers, and she intended to press it before her enemies could regroup. In the capital, the most dangerous threat to her grandson's throne still lived. Philip III Aridaeus, half-brother to Alexander, and a puppet in the hands of her rivals. Olympias saw him not as a man, but as a symbol, a banner under which Cassander's faction could rally, and symbols, she knew, had to be destroyed. The execution was swift, ruthless, and theatrical. Philip III and his wife Eurydice were seized, stripped of their dignity, and paraded as traitors. Before the eyes of the court and the soldiers, Olympias struck them down, a strike against pretenders, a bloody declaration that the throne belonged only to the true blood of Alexander. No speeches were necessary. The message burned itself into the minds of every watching face. But even as cheers rose from her supporters, the air carried an undertone of unease. Such open defiance of royal bloodlines, such public brutality, was a double-edged sword. Those who feared her now feared her more, and fear, she knew, could breed alliances among even the most bitter enemies. Olympias did not care. Her return had shattered the stagnant balance of power. She had made herself the center of the board once again, and all pieces, kingmakers, generals, and warlords, would now have to move in response to her. The game was hers to dictate, at least for the moment. But the Queen's thunderous return was only the opening strike. Her vengeance had not yet reached its true target. Cassandra's allies, those who whispered against her in council halls and plotted in candlelit rooms, would feel the full weight of her fury, one by one. The storm had only begun to break. The Queen had returned, and now the serpent would strike. Olympias's reappearance in Macedon was not simply a restoration of her power, it was a summons to judgment. Those who had stood with Cassander, who had whispered in his councils and tightened the noose around Alexander's bloodline, would face a reckoning in blood. She moved with the precision of a general and the artistry of a performer. A sculptor carving her son's legacy in stone. Each stroke deliberate, each cut irreversible. The purge began quietly, with loyalists vanishing from their estates in the dead of night. Their bodies, when found, bore messages as much as wounds. Daggers left in hands, coins placed over eyes, a crown's emblem pressed into cooling flesh. This was no mindless slaughter. It was theater, designed so every survivor would understand the lesson. At the center of her vengeance stood Queen Eurydice, widow of Philip III, and a rallying point for Cassander's cause. Eurydice was young, clever, and ambitious, the sort of woman Olympias would have admired under different stars. But here, in this brutal constellation of rivalries, she was an enemy too dangerous to leave alive. The death of Eurydice was staged as nothing less than divine justice. Olympias had her brought to the temple, dressed not in mourning black, but in the white robes of a condemned priestess. Before the gathered court and soldiers, she accused Eurydice not just of treachery against the crown, but of sacrilege, of offending the gods by opposing the rightful heir of Alexander. The crowd was silent as Olympias handed her a noose, a final mockery of choice: take her own life in the sacred precinct or be dragged from it by the guards. Eurydice, proud to the end, chose the former. Her body was left in the temple's shadow for a day and a night, an unmissable warning. In the weeks that followed, Cassander's web of allies in Macedon began to unravel. Some fled to his strongholds, others knelt at Olympias's feet, swearing new oaths. A few, convinced that death was inevitable, attempted assassination. Each one foiled, each conspirator executed in ways that magnified her reputation for ruthlessness. For a fleeting moment, Macedon bent entirely to her will. The crown she placed upon young Alexander IV's head was not secured by treaties or tradition. It was a crown held by will alone. Every law, every order, every judgment in the kingdom flowed through her hands. The army obeyed her, the people feared her, and the temples, though uneasy, recognized her as a queen who ruled with the favor of gods, or at least with the power to punish those who doubted it. Yet beneath the triumph, shadows gathered. Her enemies were not defeated, only scattered. Cassander, patient as a hunter, bided his time beyond her reach. Every act of her vengeance, every public execution, every humiliation of a rival was another stone in the fortress of fear she had built. But it was also another arrow in her enemies' quivers, ready to be turned against her. And then, the counterstroke came. Cassander moved not with open battle at first, but with quiet, relentless pressure, cutting off her allies, tightening the siege, and forcing the serpent back into a corner. Olympias's moment of supreme power was ending, and the jaws of revenge were about to close on her. The walls of Pydna rose like the last ramparts of her life, a ring of stone holding both her hope and her doom. Cassander's armies encircled the city in a tightening noose, cutting off every path, every whisper of escape. Olympias, who had once commanded kingdoms and bent generals to her will, now found herself a lion in a cage of stone. Yet in her eyes, there was no surrender. Only the hard, cold gleam of a ruler who still believed the gods might yet favor her. Her defiance was a flame burning in a dying hearth. It flickered against the winds of despair, refusing to vanish even as the fuel of her cause, supplies, allies, morale, burned away to ash. She walked the streets daily, speaking to soldiers and citizens alike, her voice carrying the authority of a queen and the steel of a commander. "No siege will bend Macedon's rightful guardian," she told them, though even she could taste the bitter truth behind the words. The hardships came like waves against the walls. Starvation gnawed at the city first, turning bread into dust and meat into memory. Disease followed, creeping through narrow streets, felling the weak and the strong alike. Every morning the dead were carried to hastily dug graves beyond the gates, each funeral a quiet chisel blow against the city's will to resist. Her allies, once fierce and loyal, began to fade away. Some slipped out under the cover of darkness, hoping to bargain their survival with Cassander. Others, too proud to beg, stayed but avoided her gaze, unable to reconcile the queen's unshaken pride with the hunger hollowing their bellies. Still, Olympias did not bend. She held her own court within the besieged city, receiving messengers, issuing decrees, and leading rituals to invoke divine favor. In the great hall, beneath banners now faded and frayed, she lit sacred fires and poured libations to Zeus, to Dionysus, and to the shade of her son. To those who gathered, it was a reminder of the past glories she defended. To herself, it was a vow. If she was to fall, it would be as a queen, not as a prisoner. Outside the walls, Cassander waited, knowing that time was his greatest weapon. He did not storm the city. He let hunger and despair be his soldiers. And though Olympias's voice never wavered, the silence in the streets grew heavier each day, the air thick with the knowledge that no rescue would come. By the winter's end, the siege had done its work. The lion's cage had grown smaller, the flame in the hearth smaller still. Even the most loyal of her guard began to wonder whether death inside the walls was any nobler than life in surrender. Yet Olympias remained in the palace, unyielding, a queen who bows to no siege. And so, when the gates finally opened, it was not with the cries of victory, but with the slow, heavy footsteps of fate. Cassander's men entered Pydna, not to meet a broken woman, but to claim their prize and to prepare her for her final moments. Cassander stood before the gates of Pydna, the bitter wind carrying with it the scent of a hollow victory. The city had fallen, but the prize he had come for, Olympias, was unlike any other captive. In his mind, killing her outright was no simple matter. She was the mother of Alexander the Great, the queen who had ruled through storms and assassinations, a woman whose name still stirred fear and reverence in equal measure. To shed her blood too carelessly risked cursing the gods themselves. When they brought her forth, she did not walk like a prisoner, but like a monarch on parade. Her back was straight, her gaze level, her steps measured. Shackles bound her wrists, but they did not diminish her presence. She was a statue unbroken even in chains, the marble of her bearing untouched by the rusted iron at her sides. Soldiers glanced at one another uneasily, as if the air itself bent under her will. Cassander, calculating and cold, refused to stain his own hands. Instead, he summoned the families of those she had executed in her ruthless purges, the kin of Philip III, of Eurydice, of the men who had once stood in his shadow. "If vengeance is your right," he told them, "take it now." Perhaps he hoped that by making her death a communal act, he could strip it of its political poison. But Olympias knew the game. She met the crowd's eyes not with fear, but with the calm of someone who had already looked beyond the mortal span. "Strike if you must," she is said to have told them, her voice as steady as it had been in the courts of Pella. "But know that you do not kill a woman. You kill a queen of Macedon." The crowd hesitated at first. Her gaze was too sharp, her presence too commanding. But anger and grief are heavier than reverence, and soon the first blow was struck. Not by a soldier of Cassander, but by one of those she had wronged. Others followed, their fury breaking through the thin veneer of fear. She did not cry out. Even as her body fell, her head remained high, her eyes locked on some distant horizon. Those eyes, witnesses claimed, were like an oracle's seeing beyond death. In them was not defeat, but a strange, almost defiant serenity, as if she beheld a future in which her enemies would be dust and her name still spoken. When the last blow fell and the great serpent queen lay still, a hush spread through the gathered crowd. Cassander had removed his most dangerous rival, but in doing so, he had etched her death into the chronicles of Macedon. No monument marked her grave, yet the story of her life, her cunning, her cruelty, her unyielding pride, would outlast stone. For even in death, Olympias remained more than mortal. Her legacy, tangled in blood and legend, would haunt the corridors of power for generations, a whisper of the queen who had once bent an empire to her will. In the wake of her death, silence fell over Macedon, not the peace of resolution, but the hush that lingers after a storm has torn through the land. Olympias was gone, yet her absence was a presence in itself, heavy and impossible to ignore. She had been many things: mother, queen, priestess, conspirator, and in the end, she became something far greater. Not a queen, but a myth woven in blood. Her enemies might have celebrated her fall, but they could not erase her. The tale of her life began to slip from the realm of politics into the domain of legend, told and retold in whispers and grand speeches alike. Each retelling polished certain edges and sharpened others, until she stood not merely as a woman of history, but as a figure carved into the bedrock of Macedonian identity. She became a tapestry that time cannot unravel. Its threads dyed in ambition, vengeance, and unshakable will. Her legacy was bound to Alexander's as tightly as mother to son. There could be no divine conqueror without the fierce woman who had nurtured and defended him. In every story of the boy who would be king, her shadow fell across the opening act. She had lit the fire that burned in him, stoked it with belief in his godlike destiny, and shielded it from the winds of betrayal. No divine son without her fire, a truth the chroniclers could neither deny nor diminish. And yet history did not paint her only in glory. Her ruthlessness, her cunning, the bodies left in her wake, these too became part of the myth. Like the serpent she was so often compared to, she was both protector and predator, capable of wrapping herself around her chosen cause even as she struck down those who threatened it. In the memory of Macedon, she was not softened by time. Instead, her figure coiled tighter, denser, more potent, until she seemed less a person than a force, a storm given a woman's face, a dagger sheathed in silk. She endured in the symbols she had claimed for herself: the serpent, the crown, the sacred rites. She became a serpent coiled in history's heart, unblinking, eternal, waiting for the moment when her story would be told again. Her life was not a cautionary tale nor a simple tragedy. It was a testament to what power can be when wielded without apology, and to the price exacted for such defiance. Long after her bones were dust, her name could still summon the image of a woman who bent kings to her will and challenged the fates themselves. But to understand the roots of such myth-making, we must step far from the marble halls of Macedon and travel back in time, to an island in the Aegean where a different kind of power flourished in the labyrinthine palace of Knossos. The Minoan civilization, long vanished yet endlessly fascinating, would weave its own legends into the human story. On the island of Crete, where the sea kisses the shore in shades of sapphire and foam, rises a place that blurs the boundary between history and dream. Knossos is not merely ruins of stone, it is a city dreaming within stone walls, a place where every arch, corridor, and chamber hums with the echoes of an ancient pulse. Even in its broken state, the palace seems alive, as though it might wake at any moment and resume the life it once held. From above, Knossos spreads like a giant's mosaic, rooms spilling into courtyards, staircases rising and falling, as if following the rhythm of an unseen dance. To walk its pathways is to feel yourself inside a puzzle carved by gods, solved by none. The design is bewildering: hallways that turn without reason, chambers nested within chambers, spaces that lead you in circles until the sense of direction slips away. Its builders were not content with mere functionality. Here, art and utility are married in a way the ancient world rarely saw. The walls bloom with frescoes, dolphins leaping in brilliant blue waters, lithe youths vaulting over the backs of bulls, priestesses draped in flowing garments, their eyes calm and knowing. Even the smallest rooms bear marks of care and vision, as though the palace was meant to please not only its rulers, but the gods themselves. Technological marvels hide in plain sight. Centuries before Rome laid its aqueducts, Knossos boasted running water and a complex plumbing system. Light wells channeled the Cretan sun deep into its interior, and ventilation shafts whispered the island's sea breeze into enclosed spaces. Every innovation speaks of a civilization not only skilled in craft, but bold in imagination. And yet beneath the awe, there is an unease. Something about Knossos resists being fully known. The palace's layout defies simple logic, and some scholars whisper that this was deliberate. A place built to confuse intruders, to hold secrets, or perhaps to embody a deeper, more sacred purpose. It is here, in this tangle of stone, that one of the ancient world's most enduring myths takes root. Generations have told of a king, a monstrous offspring, and a labyrinth so cunningly made that escape was all but impossible. The palace's twisting corridors and endless chambers may well have given birth to that legend. Imagine, in the age before maps and electric light, what it would be like to wander Knossos, shadows stretching across painted walls, the sound of footsteps echoing without source, every turn offering the possibility of both discovery and doom. Whether by design or by coincidence, Knossos embodies the labyrinth in both form and spirit. To stand within its ruins is to feel the pull of that story, to sense the hidden chambers where truth and fiction blend until neither can be untangled. And so the palace gives way to the legend, a tale of a king's pride, a queen's curse, and a beast born of both man and bull. This is the story of the Minotaur, and like Knossos itself, it has trapped the imagination for thousands of years. Long before the dust of time settled on Knossos, the island of Crete was said to be home to a secret both wondrous and terrible. A beast born of man and bull, hidden away in a labyrinth where sunlight never touched the ground. The story has been told in countless voices. A king named Minos, a queen cursed by the gods, and the monstrous child who was the price of that curse. The creature, called the Minotaur, lived in darkness, fed by the tribute of Athens, young men and women sent to their deaths as payment for past defeat. There, in the twisting maze, the Minotaur waited, a living nightmare in the heart of the earth. Into this shadowed prison stepped Theseus, prince of Athens, whose courage matched his cunning. Guided by Ariadne, Minos' own daughter, and her threat of escape, Theseus slew the beast and found his way back to the light. It is a story of heroism, betrayal, and the thin line between savagery and civilization. But like all ancient myths, the tale may be a shadow cast by a forgotten truth. What was the Minotaur truly? Perhaps not a literal monster, but the echo of Minoan ritual. Ceremonies where young acrobats leapt over bulls in feats both dangerous and sacred, blurring the boundary between man and beast. To outsiders, such rites might have seemed strange, even terrifying, and in the retelling, they could have grown into something monstrous. Or perhaps the Minotaur was a metaphor for Crete's dominance. The labyrinth could stand for the intricate political and economic web Minos wove over the Aegean, a network so complex that foreign states found themselves trapped within it, unable to escape without paying their due. In this reading, Theseus's victory marks the breaking of that dominance, a shift in the balance of power. Some have even suggested the labyrinth is not only a physical place, but a symbol of the human mind, a tangle of memories, fears, and desires, with a beast lurking at its center, something primal we must all confront. In this way, the story speaks to more than history. It becomes a timeless parable of courage and self-discovery. The truth may be a blend of all these threads. Myths are rarely pure invention. They grow from seeds planted in real soil, nurtured by culture, politics, and imagination, until they bloom into something larger than life. Knossos, with its sprawling corridors and hidden chambers, gave that seed a fitting home. Yet the Minotaur is only one strand in the Minoan tapestry. To understand its place, we must step back and see the civilization that created it, its wealth, its reach, and the strange, brilliant culture that rose from the heart of Crete. The Minoans did not simply live on the sea, they danced with it. From their harbors, ships with high prows and bright-painted hulls sailed across the glittering Aegean, bearing goods from distant shores. Bronze tools, fine ceramics, and delicate jewelry moved in and out of Crete, while in return came copper from Cyprus, ivory from Egypt, and exotic dyes from lands beyond sight. This was not a kingdom hemmed in by its island. This was a civilization whose reach stretched like a net cast across the Mediterranean. In art, the Minoans revealed their soul. Frescoes burst with color, dolphins leaping in blue waters, women in flowing skirts with curling hair, youths mid-flight over the backs of powerful bulls. These were not stiff, solemn portraits. They pulsed with motion, laughter, and life. To walk through the halls of Knossos was to see the Minoans' world through their own eyes, a celebration of nature, beauty, and human daring. Knossos stood at the heart of it all, a palace that was more than a palace. It was a hub where ritual, economy, and governance converged. Storerooms brimmed with amphorae of oil and grain, while in ceremonial spaces, priests and priestesses enacted rites whose meaning is still hidden from us. The palace's sprawling design, with its winding corridors and layered courtyards, made it both a center of power and a living mystery. To outsiders, it must have seemed like the very embodiment of Crete's wealth and sophistication. Yet for all we know, much remains veiled. The Minoans wrote, but they wrote in a script we cannot yet read. Linear A, a voice lost to time. Its signs appear on clay tablets, seals, and religious offerings, whispering of laws, trade records, and sacred invocations that will not yield their secrets. Without its translation, the Minoans remain half-hidden, like figures glimpsed through sea mist, and so they appear to us in history, a flame that burned bright before fading. Their trade routes once shimmered with activity, their ships once dominated the waves, their culture radiated color and vitality. But every civilization has its twilight. The Minoans left behind walls and art, but not the answers we seek. We see their glory and cannot help but wonder, how could something so vibrant fade into silence? To find that answer, we must turn to the final chapter of Knossos, not in its glory, but in its fall, when the halls that once echoed with music and commerce became silent under the weight of catastrophe. Knossos, once the beating heart of the Minoan world, did not end in a blaze of battle. Its fall came quietly, like a song cut off mid-note. The frescoes still clung to the walls, the storerooms still held their treasures, but the people were gone. What remained was not the wreckage of war, but an emptiness that seemed almost deliberate, as if the island itself had exhaled and fallen still. Historians have long debated the cause of this silence. One theory points to the eruption of Thera, a cataclysm so immense that it darkened the skies, sent tsunamis crashing across the Aegean, and poisoned the air with ash. If true, Knossos may have been undone not by human hands, but by the wrath of nature itself. Another view holds that it was the Mycenaeans, mainland warriors, who crossed the sea and claimed the palace. In this telling, the takeover was swift, leaving the architecture intact but replacing the ruling elite. Others suggest a more subtle undoing, internal collapse from political strife, dwindling resources, or the slow erosion of trade that had once sustained the island's prosperity. Yet in every version, one detail stands out. There is little sign of violence, no charred ruins, no mass graves. The storerooms do not bear the marks of desperate looting, the walls carry no scars of siege. The end was not a scream, but a hush. Perhaps the people left, abandoning their great halls for reasons lost to time, or perhaps they stayed until the very last, fading into the silence they left behind. Knossos did not vanish from memory, however. In the centuries that followed, its image was preserved in Greek myths, but not as a real city. It became the backdrop for tales of kings and monsters, of labyrinths and heroes. The palace's twisting corridors may have birthed the legend of the Minotaur. Its vanished people, transformed in story, became the figures of Ariadne, Daedalus, and Minos. The living Knossos was gone, but the mythic Knossos lived on, eternal in the stories told by poets and sailors. And so, the fall of Knossos was not just the end of a city, but the passing of a world. Its courtyards no longer rang with the sound of bull leaping or the laughter of festival nights. The sea that had once brought it wealth became an empty horizon. What remained was the echo, a shadow of power, beauty, and mystery that could never quite be recaptured. Yet the stillness of Knossos is not the only kind of ending history knows. Many great powers have met their fate not in silence, but in fire, steel, and the roar of armies. To understand that other face of destruction, we must turn to the brutal reality of siege warfare, where power is tested, walls are broken, and survival is measured in days. For as long as humans have built walls, other humans have sought to bring them down. Siege warfare is the brutal conversation between defense and attack, spoken not in words, but in stone, fire, and steel. At its heart are the engines of ruin, rams, catapults, and trebuchets, each one designed to turn the safety of walls into a trap for those inside. A siege weapon is more than just a tool. It is the hands of war reshaping stone, fingers of wood, rope, and iron, reaching across moats and battlements to tear at a city's heart. The simplest of these, the battering ram, began as a log gripped by men who slammed it against gates until they splintered. Later, rams were suspended in wheeled shelters, their momentum multiplied, their crews protected from arrows and boiling oil. What once required courage alone now demanded cunning engineering. Catapults marked a leap forward, machines capable of hurling heavy stones, burning pitch, or even diseased carcasses over enemy walls. The torsion-powered onager could smash a parapet from hundreds of feet away, while the ballista, a giant crossbow, could pick off defenders with frightening precision. The air above a besieged city often whistled with projectiles, each one a promise of collapse. Then came the trebuchet, the king of medieval siegecraft. Powered not by twisted ropes but by gravity itself, this counterweight machine could fling a missile weighing hundreds of pounds with devastating accuracy. Watching one in action was to witness a blend of physics and spectacle, a massive arm swinging in slow, deliberate arcs, releasing its payload in a graceful, terrible parabola that ended with the shattering of stone. Unlike the catapult, the trebuchet was as much about intimidation as destruction. The knowledge that a single strike could rip through walls could sap a defender's will before the final breach. Over centuries, these machines evolved alongside fortifications. As towers grew taller and walls thicker, siege weapons became heavier, stronger, and more precise. Engineers experimented with multi-stage rams, siege towers that rolled forward like moving fortresses, and devices to undermine walls from below. Every innovation in defense sparked an answer in attack, a relentless arms race of stone against steel. To be inside a city under siege was to live with constant tension. Every day the walls were tested. Every night, the enemy's machines loomed in the moonlight. The sound of a ram's steady thud could become as unbearable as the crash of a trebuchet's shot. Sometimes, the city fell in hours. Other times, it resisted for months or even years. But at a terrible cost, starvation, disease, and despair were as much weapons as the engines outside the walls. The legacy of siege warfare is more than a list of machines. It is the proof that human ingenuity thrives in both creation and destruction. These were physics weaponized, equations built from timber and rope, the principles of leverage and momentum turned toward the singular goal of breaking what others had built. Even in our own age, the shadow of these machines lingers. In modern artillery, in bunker-busting bombs, in the idea that no wall is truly unbreakable. In the end, siegecraft tells us as much about the human will to conquer as it does about our will to endure. For every wall raised, there has always been someone willing to tear it down, a cycle as old as civilization itself. And in that cycle lies the essence of power, survival, and the unending struggle between the fortress and the storm.